Hey everyone, it's Sheri Vegas here, and in this tutorial I'm going to talk about resin and pigments and which you should use for which job and what I use for each job personally. So I know there's so many resins and so many different types of pigments out there, and a lot of them can be used in a lot of different forms and mediums. So I'm just going to go over what I use personally, what I found works for me, and also what the manufacturers have told me, because I do work alongside a few of these manufacturers. This is not sponsored at all. This is just what I pick every single time, because this is what I've used and I know it works. So I'm going to get started, and I've got 4 resins here, but I do use a few more because I do create a lot of different resin works. So I do a lot of casting with resin, a lot of jewelry making. I also do a lot of bridal resin works, and I also do a lot of artworks as well as the workshops that I teach in Brisbane and the Gold Coast. So I do work with a wide variety of resins and a wide variety of pigments, and this is what I've learned over, I think, the 4+ years that I've been doing this, and this is what's worked for me. So the first resin that I'm going to be talking to you guys today about is the Art Resin. So the reason why I always work with this resin, and this is for a few reasons, it is at a higher price point, so that is a little bit of a con to it. It is one of the most expensive resins on the market, but there is good reason why it's one of the most expensive resins on the market and why I do buy it and do prefer it over other type of epoxy resins. And there are a few reasons to that. So it has a really high UV resistance rate to it, and by that I mean it doesn't yellow when the sun hits it. So this is a paperweight that I've done, and this is done with the Art Resin. And Art Resin technically isn't a casting resin. It's meant to just be used for art purposes, but it does work amazing, I find, for what I need it to do. And I do my paperweights in layers, so don't feel like I've just poured this all at once. But the reason why I do use this over a casting resin, a traditional casting based resin, is because of its UV resistance, because it stays nice and clear no matter about the sun. So this one has been done with a traditional casting resin, and if you can see, I will do a close-up of this. It's already started to yellow, and it's only a few weeks old. And if I'm doing these for client pieces, that's definitely something I don't want happening. So that is why I do use my Art Resin over a traditional casting resin, because it just has that really gorgeous high UV resistance rate, which is also great if you are doing artworks, because you need your artworks to stay the color that they are. Everyone hangs their artworks up on their wall, and obviously sunlight will be hitting those walls, and you don't want over time the colors in your artwork to change. So that is one of the main reasons why I do use the Just Resin. It does have a really long pot life. I think it's got like something like a 40 or 60 minute pot life. So once you've mixed your resin up together, your resin and your hardener together, it actually can last a really long time. So you get longer to work with it when you are creating an artwork, which can be a really good pro, but it can also be a bit of a con, because if you are doing just a small piece and it just keeps moving and flowing throughout that time, it might actually change and not be exactly what you wanted. But that is the reason why I do always come back to this resin, is just because it's got such a super high UV resistance rate to it, and because I do a lot of bridal work, which I want to give a bride like her flowers in resin, and I don't want it to change. I want it to stay exactly the same. It also doesn't heat up like a casting resin, because if you've ever used casting resin with flowers, sometimes they can heat up and thermal react they get quite hot, and it can actually make your flowers go translucent, or it kind of starts to cook the flower in the resin. So I actually do like to use it for casting, even though it's technically not meant to be used for that. It also does get quite a lot of bubbles if you do mix it quite very vigorously. So you do need to really slow down your mixing with this, especially if you are using it for a casting version. But I do find it works best for what I'm after. I have used a few other casting resins, and I just find anytime I do anything that's clear, they just over time will always yellow. They are great because they're normally a 2-to-1 ratio, so they get less bubbles. But I just find that I would prefer to just combat the bubbles and work out how to get rid of those than to have my pieces yellow over time, because no one wants to buy something and then a few weeks later it's gone yellow. So those are my few reasons why I do always go back to this epoxy resin. Another epoxy resin that I do use a lot is the epoxy glass. The epoxy glass is from Bronze, which is an Australian brand, and it's a 1:1 ratio, which I do love the 1:1 ratios because it just makes it so much easier when measuring out. This is can be used for casting as well if you wanted to, or you can use an actual casting resin if you need it to be a bit tougher and a bit stronger. Epoxy resins will never be as strong as your typical casting resins. They're a bit more flexible and they can't handle power tools as well. So if you are casting dishes like this, it generally is better, like a freestanding dish, to go with a general casting resin. But this is amazing for artworks. It has a really nice viscosity to it. And what I mean by that is it flows really well. I've used other resins in the past and I found that the viscosity was either too runny or too thick. And if they're too runny, they disperse the pigment too much and you don't get those beautiful build-up of colours, or you don't get lines and patterns and shapes forming. It tends to just go into a blur. And when you use a resin that's too thick, you find it is really hard to push through and work and get it to create patterns. So you want to find that really happy medium, and this has kind of got the viscosity of honey, and it's the reason why I like to use it, because it flows really beautifully over the board, but it's not too thin and too runny, and it's also not too thick. It's also food safe, and so is the Art Resin. Art Resin is also food safe, which is another plus for one of the reasons why I use both of these resins. This one is at a bit of a cheaper price point, and I do really like working with this because of the viscosity to it. It also is quite clear, so when you do look for a resin, if one part is really yellow and one part is clear, no matter what, that you'll still always have that slight yellow tinge to it. So a good resin both parts should be really clear. So when you are looking for different brands of resin, you want to find one that you get A and B are as clear as possible. The older the resin is, the more yellow the resin gets. So it is important, if you are buying your resin in store, to just open up the box and double check that it's clear. So this one's nearly done up, but see, both parts are still really clear, and that's what you want when you are looking for an epoxy resin, is you want both parts to be clear. I've used a few other brands which I just won't mention because I don't want to poo-poo on another brand, but I've just never been happy with them because they've always had one part is really yellow, and then you find like your whites and your pastels will always have that underbase of that amber color coming through. So when you are looking for epoxy resin, you want to make sure that it's clear, it's got a good viscosity to it, it's got a UV resistance, and it's food safe if you are going to be using it for purposes where people will be putting like chopping boards, any sort of food products on it. So generally those are the things that I look for when I am going for an epoxy resin for my different jobs that I will be using that suits epoxy resin. Now let's go down to some polyurethane resins. So your polyurethane resin is generally quite stronger and it's great for casting. These two here are from the Barnes, and I've got the Easy Cast and the Bee Queen. So your Easy Cast is a white setting resin like this, so that's just had a drop of turquoise put into it, and this one's had swirls of colour. Great for jewelry making, and this is what I do use in my workshops because it sets super fast and they're really tough, because obviously jewelry, it's gonna, especially on your wrist, it's gonna get banged around, and they do need to be tough, as well as they need to be sanded back, so it needs to be able to take that heat and the pressure from when it gets sanded back. So that is one of the reasons why I love using these two casting resins, is because the polyurethane is nice and tough. The second reason is it sets super fast. So this sets within minutes. So you've got around 30 seconds to a minute to mix up your resin, and because it's super fluidy, it does mix really fast, unlike these that take a few minutes to mix in. It's got the viscosity of water to it, so be careful when you are using it that it doesn't splash back up, but it will set within 10 minutes. Your bank will be ready to be pulled out. So that's why I do like using this, because if you are wanting to produce a few bangles from that same mold, you don't want to be waiting 24 hours for an epoxy based resin to set. You want something that can set within minutes. You can pull it out, put it aside, and make your next bangle. So it's also great when I am doing workshops because people can swap over molds and they're not waiting, and I can take the molds home with me instead of leaving them there at the workshop space. So this one's great because it's white based and you do get a really beautiful pastel colours with this one. The next one is your Bee Queen. So your Bee Queen is actually a clear setting resin, and these are both being made with the Bee Queen. So these are great because you get that really bright, vibrant colour, and you can also get the beautiful translucent parts in your resin. You can mix your pigments into these and create some really beautiful patterns like this, and it's all got the same benefits as the Easy Cast. So these are great for jewelry making, and they are also great for any sort of casting that you're wanting to do. The few downsides when you do work with a polyurethane resin is because it sets super fast, you have to work super fast. So if you're not quite there, or you're very slow, or you want to do layers, you got to make sure that you pick the right resin for the job. I personally find that it's plenty of time to make a bangle because you are literally just pouring it into a mold. But some people do get a bit stressed, especially if you are doing a larger item with getting it all mixed and getting all your pigments mixed in. So that is one downside, but it is also one plus side, is how fast it sets. So it just depends if you can adapt to that and work with that. Your polyurethane is a bit more temperamental than an epoxy, so that is a con to it. All your molds have to be cleaned out with alcohol spray beforehand. Polyurethane doesn't react well to water, it doesn't react well to epoxy, so if you've poured something epoxy in your mold beforehand and then you go to pour something polyurethane in your mold, it might not actually work really well with that. It actually might throw off the way it sets. So that is something to be really cautious about, is to not mix your epoxy based tools, so your measuring cups, your spatulas, all of that, with your polyurethane. You need to keep those separate or give them a proper clean out with some alcohol spray. Your polyurethane only takes certain types of pigments, and this is something that you have to be really, really careful about, is if you put the wrong pigments in this, it can either set in your cup super fast, or it can start to have a really adverse chemical reaction and bubble up in your cup. So please do only use the pigments that it says can be used in this, so they have to be polyurethane suitable, because you might have a bunch of epoxy pigments, but they might not work in this one. So that is something you need to consider when you are working with a polyurethane, but there are lots of pluses and lots of cons with all the different resins, so you've just got to pick the right one for the job. So this is something else that I just wanted to quickly touch on with the Bee Queen resin, is that this is already an amber base because it's a polyurethane clear resin, and that means that you will always get a slight amber color to it. So it isn't ideal if you want to do any clear casting like something like this, because it will always have that undertone to it. But it is great when you do want to just make items that have color into them like this, but it isn't good if you want to add flowers or any other objects into your casting. So that is one little downside about this type of resin, but it does set super fast. So it is great if you are just making jewelry like this that will have a color through it. So now we've had a talk about the resins that we do use, let's talk about the pigments that you can put into them. So I have a few different pigments that I like to use, and I'm going to show you all of these. So the first one up is just a metallic pigment. So this one is actually from Barnes, and I find that this pigment can be, your metallic range of pigments can go in all sorts of resins. They're really great universal ones. They are super bright, super vibrant, and they can go in your epoxy-based pigments, and they can also go in your polyurethane-based pigments. They are definitely worth getting. They are at a higher price point than your other pigments because they are metallics. Artisue Pigments are one of my favourite pigments to use. I actually have a full range. The reasons why I like powder pigments is you get a longer pot life with them. So over using a pigment paste, your powder pigments, because they don't have anything else into them except for the pigment, they're not going to go off like a pigment paste. And the Artisue range, for the amount you get, it's actually really cost effective than buying something that's in that size. So I'm pretty sure these are the same price, but I will get at least double the amount out of this than I will out of this. Your con with working with powder pigments is you really have to mix them through. not all powder pigments mix amazingly well, so you really need to work it through, or pour just a tiny bit of resin in, mix that up, and then pour the rest, because I find if you put too much resin in with your powder pigments, it just takes so long to make sure it's evenly mixed through, because you don't want to be pouring your resin out and all of a sudden a pocket of powder that didn't get mixed just goes out onto your artwork, and then you've got to try and get it off. But they don't go off the way that your other pastes go off, and they don't dry out because it's already a dry product. So your powder pigments do have a lot of pros to them. They're just a little bit more effort to mix in to your resin. Next up are tints. So this is a tint from Just Resin, and I really do like these. They're super cost effective. I think I bought a pack of 12 of them, and really highly pigmented. A few drops goes a really long way, and that is the same with the Barnes. They don't sell like packs of 12, but they do have packs of, I think, 4. Really highly pigmented, really beautiful color payoff, and your Barnes one, unlike this one, can be mixed in with your polyurethane and your epoxy and polyester resin. So I highly recommend getting these because they can go through all different types of resin and you get the same result every single time, and they are super vibrant. So if you add 1 drop in, you get obviously a really light sheer color. If you add a few drops in, you get a lot more bolder color. The great thing about tints is you can create some really cool effects and patterns when you do work with your tints. Tints are beautiful because they just really sheer color. So I definitely recommend, if you are starting out, get a few tints and add them into your color range. The only downside about this one is because it's not in a dropper bottle and it's just pour out, sometimes it pours out and you get a few drops, and sometimes it pours out and it pours so much more out than what you intentionally needed. So just be careful when you do pour it out. I would really love it if they actually started making this in a dropper bottle like this, because this is a lot easier to work with getting your drops, because you can literally go 1, 2, 3, however many. You've got much more control over this bottle than you do with this, and because they're so liquidy, they can just pour straight out and you can overfill your color. The last pigments that I'm going to talk about, this one's from Art Creations, and they actually have a really beautiful range of pigments. These only work, in my opinion, with your epoxy-based resins. I have tried using them in the polyurethanes before and they just don't work. And the reason why is because a lot of the time in your epoxy pigment paste, like this one, this is a paste, they put a little bit of resin into the pigment and mix that through, and that's how you create that paste. But because it's already got a bit of epoxy resin in it, when you then add it to a different type of resin, it's going to have an adverse reaction and it's going to throw off that chemical reaction. So I have tried it in these and I got it to work, but it just wasn't as amazing as if I had just stuck to pigments that were designed for this. So it can work, but I found that the color was off and it made the resin go a bit gloopy and set a bit fast. So I don't recommend using this for anything but your epoxy resins. They're really beautiful, tons of different colors, and they've got metallics plus just your matte colors. I really do like them, but they do have a few pros and a few cons. So if you don't use these up in time, I think they have anywhere from 6 months to 1 year pot life. So if it's a color that you're not going to be using much, you might end up having to throw it out before it's run out. And you do have to give these, I find in Queensland, because it's so hot here, and because they go on the back of my car because I'm traveling from workshop to workshop, they can split. So they do mix back in again, but you do have to give them a really good stirring before you then put them into your paste, because they do split really easily in the heat of Queensland. But they are a really nice colour range, and I do really like the Art Creation pigments. Art Creation also has some really beautiful glitters that are designed to work in resin, because your normal craft glitter doesn't work amazingly in resin, because it actually, over time, the resin will take that colour. And if you've ever put a craft glitter in resin and waited a little bit, like a few weeks, you'll notice that the colour's actually bled out from the glitter and gone through the resin. So when you are looking at glitters for your resin, buy them through a resin supplier, because that way you'll know that they'll be suitable. But Art Creations does have a really wide range of glitters. It's a little bit overwhelming actually with the amount of glitters they've got. but they are suitable to work in resin. First started off working with resin, and you can see this way back in my old videos. I did use acrylic paints and alcohol inks and Indian inks and a wide variety of pigments. I even used eyeshadow pigments in resin. And the reason why I don't use those anymore, but I did back then, was because I just didn't have the knowledge that I do now. So even though they did work out, I didn't get as good of an artwork or a color payout that I could have if I had been using the correct pigments. And that is something that did take me a little while to figure out, and I always kind of used the acrylic paints because I thought, oh well, you get such a big size and they're actually cheaper. But because all of these pigments are so highly pigmented, you actually get more value for money buying something like this than you do from buying craft paint, because you use the tiniest amount over when you use a craft paint. And the reason why I've also stopped using those other pigments that haven't been designed for resin is because sometimes they work and sometimes they don't, and you don't want to keep wasting your resin using stuff that might turn out, might not. Your acrylic paints are really lowly pigmented compared to these, so you actually have to put quite a lot in to get that color payout, and that throws off the chemical reaction of the resin. Because with your resin, you've got, you know, your A and your B, your hardener and your resin, and they generally are equal ratios, so the 1-to-1 ratio. And so if you put something else in and you throw that ratio out, it can either stop your resin from setting and it just will never set, or it can actually make it set too fast and go really gloopy. And I did find when I was doing that beforehand, when I first was working with resin, I couldn't ever work out why sometimes the colors would work and then sometimes they wouldn't work, and that was because of the type of pigments that I was using. So I do recommend definitely not only investing in the type of resin that you're using, but also investing in the pigments that you are using. And when I first started working, I just picked the cheapest resin that was on the market because I was new and I didn't really know what I was doing. And now I do go for my more higher end resins just because they just work better every single time. I'm guaranteed a good result. They've got high UV resistance. So if you see your resin is already really yellow, it's never got that amazing UV resistance that these guys have. Even though these guys are a little bit more expensive, if you are doing artworks for clients, it definitely is worth investing in a better quality resin and also investing in the right resin for the right jobs. And you know, you could use any of these resins. There are so many brands that are out there. These are just the resins that I use on a regular basis that I know work every single time, and these are the brands that I trust. I'm always open to trying new resins. I always keep trying new resins to see if there's something better on the market, and also brands are always improving their resin formula. So I'll probably do this video again like a year, 2 years down the track and tell you what I am using again. But this is everything that I'm currently using at the moment when I do teach my workshops and create art for my clients. Thank you guys so much for watching that. I hope it wasn't information overload and that everyone got something from this. If there is a resin that you want me to try, please put it down in the comment box below. I'm always looking for new resins. If you like this video, don't forget to give it a big thumbs up, as it really does help me out and lets YouTube show this video to more people. And if you're new to my channel, please do subscribe, as I love to post everything about art, DIY projects and home decor. Thank you guys.